What's the most brutal, sadistic, inhuman thing you could think of to punish your worst enemies? Would you think of something straightforward like physical harm or torture? Or would you hurt those closest to them? Like kidnapping their mother or significant other? How about taking their children, waiting until they're old enough to understand life and death, yet not old enough to be emotionally stable, and pitting them against each other in an enclosed arena, where the only way of getting out is to kill other children their age until only one is left standing? I'm sure most of you are familiar, but that's exactly the premise behind the widely known YA fiction, The Hunger Games trilogy. You see, The Hunger Games didn't just appear out of thin air without rhyme or reason. Originally, it was established that the games were to take place annually as a punishment and reminder for the 13 districts to never again rebel against the capital's wishes. What's interesting here, however, is that the rebels themselves aren't punished. The Hunger Games is an event that can only be played exclusively by teenagers. The rebels, who were mostly adults, aren't eligible to participate in these games. The capital wasn't directly punishing the rebels, but they were punishing their children indefinitely, for generations to come. In this video, we are going to explore this notion further. Why are these children being punished for something they never did? Should we be held responsible for something we've never done?
Crib! I volunteer! I volunteer as tribute!
Hello, heroes, and welcome back to Hero's Shadow, where we take a deep dive into our favorite heroes' minds. If it's your first time here, keep your minds open, because our discussion takes us into a topic that questions a very critical subject that affects us all. Unfortunately, the answer to these questions isn't as obvious as it may seem. The idea that is being reinforced here is akin to self-sacrifice. It is to pay the dues of the sins of the father. As social creatures, we form bonds and groups. The sins of the father assume that the groups and collectives we are a part of in turn become an extension of ourselves. In this sense, the mistakes and follies made by our forefathers and ancestors drip down and become the responsibility of the current generation. In the current socio-political sphere, this idea is very often echoed as we look back on our not-so-clean past, riddled with bigotry and discrimination. But how is this fair? It sounds absurd to suggest that, like Katniss, we are arbitrarily chosen to pay for sins committed by others. In psychology, such a concept is called collective responsibility. It is the idea that an individual might be held responsible for the actions of any member of a given group that that individual happens to be associated with. This group can be of any kind. Among notable examples are gender, race, family, or even company of employment. While seemingly unfair, bearing the sins of others is thought to be a great way of developing yourself to shoulder more responsibility. For generations, it's what's allowed human beings to constantly thrive forward. By joining the Hunger Games, Katniss discovers within herself the responsibility of those that came before her, the responsibility to fight against oppression, and how it's up to her to figure out how to overthrow it. This gradual and painful realization through experiencing the games, discovering both friends and foes, and understanding the inner workings of her own country of Panem, unlock within herself the potential that enables her to eventually become the icon of the rebellion, the Mockingjay. Here, Katniss is given the opportunity to identify with something outside of herself. It was no longer about Katniss Everdeen, and it wasn't just about her family or even just District 12 anymore. It integrates her into the greater whole of her entire generation's fight against oppression. This type of transformation is driven by the concept of group identity. For teenagers especially, identifying with a given group is a great way of exploring your identity and what you want to be like as a person. Katniss started out belonging exclusively to District 12, representing her community and family. It is what allows her to identify with the larger whole of humanity. However, group identity can also dissuade us from self-growth and transformation. When left unchecked, it possesses and corrupts the concept of the individual. De-individualization occurs, and what's left of ourselves is blurred into a muddy soup of collective anonymity. The insistence on collective responsibility, based on a dogmatic notion of group identity, is capable of some of the ugliest atrocities human beings are capable of committing. It becomes the basis of man's most dangerous vices, such as racism, bigotry, and other prejudices that begets deep irrational resentment. Among other things, it also happens to be the basis of the origins of the Hunger Games. Here, we can finally understand why the Capitol chooses to punish the children of the rebels instead of the rebels themselves. Abiding by the tenets of group identity, it establishes a clear us versus them mentality. It doesn't matter that the children aren't part of the rebellion that they're punishing the rebels for. All that matters is that in their eyes, the 13 districts, whether they happen to be involved in the rebellion or not, all fall under the same banner of the enemy. Even the rebels themselves, who are supposed to be the heroes of the trilogy, aren't quite exempt from this notion of generalizing an entire group. In the Mockingjay novel, we see this very issue take place after the Capitol has been toppled. The victors of the previous games got together to discuss the future of Panem, during which the idea of continuing the Hunger Games was issued, with the Capitol children as the participants. The 7 remaining victors, Katniss, Peeta, Haymitch, Beetee, Annie, Joanna, and Inabaria, had to vote on whether the 76th Hunger Games should be held. The vote was 4-3 in favor of those wanting another Hunger Games to be held. This further solidifies the triumph of group identity over individuals, generalizing Capitol children with those who actually took an active part in their oppressive regime.
Take a bow!
The groups we identify with can possess us and help us justify committing terrible acts of brutality. This is what happens during historical cases of ethnic cleansing, such as the one that happened during the Second World War. But why do we do these things? Why do we generalize and conflate an individual with their group? Why do we blame the blameless? Well, as human beings, we need to categorize things to function. We can't comprehend the massive variety of things we see around us. Therefore, it is essential for us to put them into their smaller little boxes so that we can process them better. Such a mental shortcut is called a heuristic. Group identity and generalization are also examples of heuristics. However, it is up to us to keep them in check and understand our own shortcomings to be able to rise over them. If you were to be demanded to be responsible for something your mother did, you might readily accept it on the account of being a good son. But what if that demand comes from the consequences of the action of a fellow countryman, or even worse, a stranger? The shouldering of responsibility is a complex issue, especially when it's a consequence of somebody else's action. On one hand, it allows us to grow and transform, to identify the faults within ourselves and society, and to improve upon them for a better future. On the other hand, it leaves us open to resentment, de-individualization, and generalization. How far are you willing to go to be responsible for the actions of others?